Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the EHAD Physiotherapists Meet the Author interview series. I'm Paula McLaughlin, the host for this session, and I'll be interviewing Dr. Paul McLaughlin regarding his recently published paper, Exercise-Based Telerehabilitation for the Management of Chronic Pain in People with Severe Haemophilia, a Mixed Methods Feasibility Study. Welcome, Paul. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. That lovely
Good.
mouthful of a title of the paper.
It is a little bit of a mouthful. Before we dive into the paper, would you be happy to introduce yourself, please, and just tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be here?
Hello, hello everyone. I'm sure most people know me or have heard of me, but my name is Paul McLaughlin. I am a clinical academic physio in haemophilia and bleeding disorders based at the Royal Free Haemophilia Centre in London. My clinical practice is adults and older adults, and I do my research sort of alongside my sort of clinical activity. And the paper we're going to talk about today sort of links in, I suppose, with my ongoing research interests and a sort of research activity.
Great. I suppose it might be a good place to start with perhaps giving an overview of the study and what you hoped to find from doing it.
So the overview of the study, I suppose, is really it's a rehabilitation intervention for chronic pain in people with haemophilia who are living with sort of painful arthropathy. And I think in a nutshell, that's probably it. But you know, as you said in the sort of rather large, long mouthful of a title, it's actually it was a sort of intervention that was done and designed sort of out of the back of COVID. It was sort of bespoke in the sense that it was sort of co-designed by people with haemophilia, but it was also, I think, a focus on sort of identifying that this is a group perhaps that doesn't fit well into other sort of arthritic type programs that are sort of designed for just having an osteoarthritic knee or an osteoarthritic hip. That often many of these people and many of the patients we work with have multiple joints affected by haemophilic arthropathy. And so essentially that was the basis of this sort of intervention, this paper, this study, was to look at the feasibility and acceptability of sort of a rehab intervention that was delivered virtually, much the same as this, in real time, by a specialist physiotherapist that knew them and their haemophilia, and to sort of see if it could be done, and could it be done the way we designed it and the way we described it. And the primary outcome, I suppose, from feasibility is that sort of is it safe, is it acceptable? So we were not looking to see if it was effective in the sense of pain management. So this is a precursor study to hopefully a much larger study or set of studies, maybe.
And would you mind telling us just a little bit more about how the co-design, how the inclusion of stakeholders influenced the study design, and then maybe also how COVID influenced it, because as you mentioned, this study did take place during COVID.
So this study was the final study in my sort of set of studies associated with my PhD, and from the outset, from sort of starting the PhD and even designing the study that the PhD was funded, co-design and sort of the input of stakeholders such as people with haemophilia was important, was key, and actually is now a requirement of all sort of health funding, and certainly in the UK from large funders. And so I had a person with lived experience who's on my trial management team. We had a sort of stakeholder group, so we had done lots of other studies, sort of qualitative studies, and sort of really try and understand the historical narrative behind pain with haemophilia, exercise, how people felt about that when they were younger, what they think about it as a potential intervention. And then including sort of a stakeholder group that when I presented them with all the background information, I suppose, and then I asked them to work with me to design a study. What kind of exercises they would want to do, how often, how it should be delivered, who should deliver it, what should it look like, how long should it last, what would they be prepared to do, what they would not be prepared to do. So essentially we sort of built in and acknowledge all the complexities. I think rehabilitation interventions are complex interventions, and I think hopefully this paper gets across, and the other papers that are sort of linked to this, that I think we have to understand that rehab is not just one thing that you give to a person and everybody does it the same way. We try to make this study sort of modifiable, so it still sits within a frame that everybody's doing mostly the same thing. But a big part of the stakeholder engagement was that they felt it was really important that people were able to participate at whatever level they felt they could, so that not everybody started on the same intensity, for example, or even for some of them the same exercises, particularly if there was an ankle or an knee issue or an arm issue or a shoulder issue. We were able to sort of swap one exercise in and one exercise out. And I think that was really important, that give it kudos, in the sense that people felt that it was a sort of, when we presented them, when we approached people, that we were able to say, we think this is a study you could participate in, and we think that because these are exercises that are designed with you and your joint health in mind. I also included some specialist physios in the sort of workup of it as well, and sort of building in realistic propositions, I suppose, what people can realistically expect to deliver in their day-to-day clinic work. And we also included a sort of knowledge and skills sharing session, which is a sort of educational type approach, with sort of a mini lecture and then sort of sharing experiences. And I think people were sort of, the word education was quite not overly popular, because again, it's about sort of learning from what others have lived with, as opposed to teaching what we think they should do. I think it's a very sort of different approach. And so very much, I think the stakeholders and people with haemophilia were central to the core tenet of designing the study and the intervention.
And I think what you've explained as well, I think it really helps to underpin and it helps us to understand why you carried it out as a feasibility study. Yeah.
I think the feasibility, haemophilia sits within the rare disease umbrella, and there aren't a huge amount of physios, for example, within that, and not everybody has access to physio or adequate physio or enough physio. And so when we begin to think about, certainly as physios, rehabilitation trials, I think we need to be quite mindful of conceptually what it is we think we're talking about when we talk about rehabilitation, but the feasibility of the delivery method, who delivers it, is it possible? Because you may have the most beautifully designed, lovely trial that requires a physio to spend 10 hours a week to do it well, and actually that's not realistic, or assuming patients want to do it for the time you specify. And so I think it's about this kind of research being a shared endeavor, because research is done with people, not to people. And so if we're looking at designing better rehabilitation trials or strategies, we probably should be more mindful what, I suppose, being able to describe what the magic ingredients are of that cake. So do you get the results you expected at the end? And if you did, why did you get those good results? However, it is also really beneficial to know why something perhaps wasn't as successful. And that's part of when we went back to the design, it was pathway modeled, so it was logic modeled, or sort of theory modeled. So each section was modeled on what came before and what came after, so that we were able to go back after the study, after the trial, and have a look at what was less successful and why, what could we change the next time to make better, to avoid, sort of downfalls or things like that. And go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to ask, I found your data collection methods really interesting. You found you used a good mix of qualitative and quantitative measures, and I think that worked particularly well in this study. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about that? Because I think the objective measures, there was maybe minimal change detected pre and post intervention, but the qualitative piece added real richness to the data and to the study.
Yeah, so we decided to do a mixed methods feasibility study. So that is that we had both a quantitative and a qualitative arm for sort of data collection and sort of data gathering, I suppose. And the quantitative within the feasibility is that we have measures of feasibility, and that's about measures of recruitment rate, time to recruitment, dropout, how many people complete the outcome measures. So very much practicalities of delivering the study. And then we had a secondary analysis of the sort of outcome measures that we had been included to be chosen. And we will be the first to put our hands up and go, there were quite a few. So we looked at pain, quality of life, and function with a sort of a series of questionnaires sort of linking to those. Now, they were chosen based on what the work we had done with the stakeholders and the qualitative stuff, papers we'd done before. And they were the best and the shortest, I suppose, of those options that we had. Excuse me. We were mindful as well, though, that taking part in rehab with a sort of rich myriad of historical narrative that people have, pain in haemophilia and arthropathic pain in particular. We also wanted to know and to understand from an acceptability perspective what people's experiences were of being in the study as a research endeavor, but also for themselves and how they felt taking part. And as you mentioned, sort of when we looked at the secondary analysis of effectiveness, the quantitative measures, so the sort of patient-reported outcome measures, there was very little difference in the pre and post scores. Now, this was a 6-week intervention, twice a week. So again, perhaps 6 weeks wasn't long enough to get a change, perhaps. But again, we don't know. We weren't designing it to as a primary outcome for change. However, when we then looked at we interviewed everybody who took part. And so part of mixed methods methodology is that you do the two sort of quant and qual together. You analyze them individually within their own domains of how you should analyze that data. And then use a method of where you sort of merge them together. And so when we began to look at the qualitative data, so whereas if you only looked at the quantitative data, it would appear that the study was safe. So nobody had any sort of major adverse events, but the outcome measures perhaps indicated that either people got had no change, or indeed maybe even felt or looked a little bit worse quantitatively. However, when we analysed the interviews, overall people really enjoyed taking part of it. They really enjoyed the camaraderie when they were doing a class. So there was an option of single face-to-face with the physio, and then second class later on in the week where sort of up to 5 people will be taking part with a sort of physio-led exercise program. And people really enjoyed that. One group did, one group didn't enjoy it. So again, it's the dynamics of group and perhaps what it brings to other people. But actually, it highlighted that overall people felt that they really benefited from taking part in the trial, but the outcome measures we had chosen were not able to quantify. They weren't granular enough to capture how they felt. And a lot of them were saying, actually, it would be better if you just asked me, do I feel better? Because I do, I feel better because. And we didn't measure things like fitness and things, and that was a practical issue in relation to the design of this study, sort of right in the middle of COVID. And so we had to make decisions based on a future intervention that we weren't quite sure what could happen because of the COVID pandemic. But essentially, it really, I suppose, recognized the value of qualitative data capture and how that perhaps struggles against a quantitative. We need a number to show effect. We need an effect to get payment. We need payment to pay for a service. And I think, there are discussions, I think, to be had with payers, but also clinics and researchers around how we collect this kind of, what is a patient-reported outcome measure, but what is a perception of value, or getting better within a trial where the arthropathy still remains. Inevitably, there's still some pain because we're not going to make the pain go away. It's perhaps a supported self-management approach. And I think it highlights the complexity that we work in, and why this kind of trial design is really important, because if we acknowledge the complexity up front, rather than trying to avoid the complex bits or the complicated bits, perhaps we should lean into the complexity a bit more, accept that it's there, and actually have some novel trial design to try and sort of really make sort of options as available for most people as possible, rather than ruling people out because they have too much pain, too many joints affected, they're too old, they're too young. You know, actually everybody has rehab potential, and we should see it like that.
Yeah, and I think it also shows that the quantitative measures that we sometimes use are not necessarily what's meaningful to the participant, to the person with chronic pain, to the person with haemophilia.
Absolutely.
And that's really important as well. And I think that by utilizing the co-design where you brought in your stakeholders, I think you were able to examine some of those features and really look at those. It sounds like that you've learned a lot from it. There were quite a few challenges along the way, I think. And you've learned a lot from it. Are you planning to do a follow-up study, or what are the next steps?
So we're currently looking at the decision, sort of re-looking at the results of the study, and we don't have a follow-up study plan per se, but actually the outcomes of this study perhaps showed us that pain, rather than focusing on pain as one comorbidity within itself, actually, when we sort of looked at the qualitative data, there was a much more sense of what it was to live better with the pain and the joint disease that people had in the trial. And perhaps might the next iteration of this be an inclusion and a sort of acknowledgement that pain is there, but actually maybe looking at a much more broader sense of what it is to be well, or to live well with what you've got, of which pain may be one thing, maybe mobility, it may be fear of falling, and they're all quite linked. Not everybody has, very few, I suppose, of our older men with haemophilia have a singular problem. So just a one joint affected or one sore bit. And I think the next step for us are how we measure effectiveness within a more holistic, wholesome, person-based level.
Yeah.
But also what a realistic intervention is that can be supported by. So one of the biggest things from patients then was that they really liked it being sort of supported by a physio who knew them and understood their haemophilia, so that they didn't have to explain any of the other stuff. They could just get on and knew that this was a safe thing for them to do because they could work with that physio. And I suppose for us, it's about what is a feasible thing that we can just perhaps design that can be done if you have limited physio, for example. Might this be a standalone type thing that could be designed? Should there be very specific modular things only for ankle pain, or only for knee pain, or only for elbow pain? Or do we keep it much more general? So as with all these things, and as with most feasibility studies, it's sort of, we were able to sort of say this bit worked really, really well, but it's actually raised a few more questions.
Yeah,
in sort of the next stage of the design of going forward.
Yeah, I think there are many ways in which it could be modified and used in different ways. Yeah, absolutely. I suppose I was wondering, were there any particular stories or feedback you got from participants that really stood out to you and kind of highlighted the impact of the intervention? So I suppose that's touching back to the qualitative piece again.
I
And
suppose one
the data you got.
story that sticks in my mind is that for many people, more or less everybody acknowledged that their pain didn't go away. So this wasn't a pain eradication program. But one chap was able to describe it, saying that they sort of described their living with pain as the bus, and that the pain was always driving the bus. And whereas actually he said then that doing this meant that he sort of had some control, so that he was actually driving the bus. The pain was still there, but there was a bit more sort of being able to live better with it, and actually he had more active choice in the days that he wanted to do stuff. He was one that actually felt much fitter after doing this, and that was with a
Okay.
relatively sort of like a moderate intensity sort of approach that we used here. And so that whole idea of not knowing what is able to change positively until you change it. So that's why it's very difficult perhaps for us to do goal setting. If you don't know or don't think something can get better, perhaps we need to do something for 6 weeks to show or help people see the benefit and the possibilities, and then go, right, actually. So again, perhaps reframing, that really made me think about reframing living with these chronic conditions, but also how the traditional model of physio intervention or rehab is you have to get the patient to give goals up front and you then work to them. But perhaps we might need to rethink that
Show them
the
what's
goal,
possible.
yeah, you need to
Yeah.
see what you're able, feel comfortable to know that you're able to change, and then make a goal that might be realistic,
Yeah.
because maybe you don't know what's realistic unless you try.
Mm.
Yeah, so that was
Um,
one of the most sort of enlightening bits of it, I think.
and it really supports that the understanding, an understanding around pain, and the fact that pain is not just a number to people. It's a lived experience. It's everything that goes on, in their lives. And as I say, it's not just a number.
Yeah, and anything we
Which is
want to
really
do to help
important.
them manage it has to be part of that life,
Mm,
and something that they feel able and willing to participate in.
mm.
And we're trying to essentially modify the experience for the better. Um, and I think that is difficult, but I think we need to do more. I think we need to challenge dogma. We need to challenge perceptions. We need to perhaps think more holistically about this as an approach. And rehab won't be for everybody, but actually
No.
we need to build up an evidence base so that we have a selection of things that we know are a feasible option, that are safe and potentially valuable. And I think that's where we currently are. We need to do more to have what a psychological intervention looks like, what a social intervention looks like, what a psychological and rehab look like together. What does a sort of a social input with psychological look like? I think it's being able to have like this pick and mix thing that works for different people at different points in that pain experience.
So that you can almost pick out building blocks and put them together depending on the specific participant,
Yeah,
and individualize the approach to
yeah.
the participant, I suppose.
And that's essentially what I'd like to see this kind of work, but this isn't the panacea, but hopefully this kind of work is a building block within somebody's sort of capability to want to do more, or to be better in themselves.
And a great place to a great study to have as part of your PhD work. And I think
Thank you.
there's lots of scope for more work arising from this. So I'm
Yeah,
looking forward to seeing what's ahead, Paul.
thank you. This is the fifth and final study from the PhD. They've all
Yeah,
been published and they're all open access. So
great.
anybody's desperate to read them, they can contact me and I can send them the links. So
That's great. Well, thanks a million for coming on and for discussing the paper. And I'm sure we'll all see you soon at EHAD, and we'll be
excellent.
EHAD conference, and we'll be able to ask more questions in
Definitely.
person. Great. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you, Paula. Bye bye.
Bye.